Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inquirer Live. My name is Luis Carrasco, Deputy Opinion Editor for the Philadelphia Inquirer. It is also my pleasure to be the direct editor of our guest today. I am pleased to welcome Trudy Rubin for a discussion on the Israel-Hamas war. Over the next hour, Trudy and I will address your questions on the conflict. What are Hamas's aims, why the war began now, how it might end, and the impact it will have on the region. Well, we hope to gain an understanding of what comes after the war and really the humanitarian costs inside Israel and Gaza. Trudy, as you may know, is the Worldview columnist for the Inquirer and a member of its editorial board. She has covered the Israel-Palestine issue for decades, including 6 years as Middle East correspondent for the Christian Science Monitor before she joined the Inquirer. And she spent 3 weeks in Israel and the West Bank back in April. Welcome, Trudy.
Very good to be here.
Excellent. Now, before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items for viewers who would like to participate in today's events. Anytime during the discussion, you'll have the opportunity to submit your questions for Trudy. To do so, please ask your questions in the comment section at the bottom of this page. If you're watching on social media, please visit inquirer.com/live to submit your questions. Now, before today, readers had a chance to submit questions, so we can start there. Trudy, a lot of people are still wondering, how was Hamas able to pull off the surprise attack that it did on October 7th? You know, it went through barriers that Israelis thought were impenetrable. And why did the attack happen now?
Right. A lot of Israelis are asking the same question. It was a shock of incredible proportions to the kibbutzim along Gaza, who had always assumed that if there was any problem, the Israeli military would be there in short order. So there are several reasons why things went so terribly wrong. One of them is that the Israeli government and the military had assumed that they could rely on technology to keep Gaza under control. At one time, there had been tunnels that went under the border where Hamas operatives could pop out of. Israel had built a deep wall down underneath the ground to block any such tunnels. They had a whole system of sophisticated electronic devices to monitor anyone crossing the border. And they thought that that was sufficient. I think that the government, the Israeli government, also thought that they had Hamas under control. There's been a lot written in the Israeli press since this horrible day, October 7th, about how the Netanyahu government assumed that because they were letting Qatar, a supporter of Hamas, send money into Gaza in cash, that this sort of bought off Hamas, and that they were satisfied just serving as the government of Gaza. In addition to that, because there was the assumption that technology ruled, the government had moved troops to the West Bank to police unrest on the West Bank that was caused by radical settlers and to protect the settlers. In fact, the week and a half before October 7th, they moved a large tranche of troops there. Settlers were going and praying in Palestinian towns on the road, and army was protecting them. So there was a relatively small amount of troops left protecting the strip, a very small amount. And because it was the Sukkot holiday, a long weekend, and it was also Shabbat, many of those troops were on leave. And so there was a total breakdown of protection. And in addition, and this is critical, the Israeli intelligence totally underestimated what Hamas was up to. Hamas used drones to disable the technological means, the cameras that were supposed to reveal anyone crossing into Israel. And they also were not communicating by cell phone, so news hadn't percolated Israeli intelligence. And finally, and this is one of the saddest and biggest lapses of intelligence. The Hamas had been training and had been putting out videos of mock attempts to cross the border. So all that stuff was out on open sources, and people had seen it in Israel. Intelligence, military, they hadn't taken it seriously. They thought that it was just practice to keep the boys busy. And they didn't understand what they were seeing was the lead up to the crossing of the border and the October 7th disaster.
Was there a reason that Hamas chose that date in particular? Was it just opportunity? Were they just waiting for that chance, or?
I think they were waiting. It's been revealed that they had been practicing for this crossing for 2 years. I think there's no question that the exact date was because it was the anniversary of the October 1973 war, the Yom Kippur War, in which the Israeli military was surprised and in which Egypt crossed a border in Sinai, that everyone thought had been well protected. So there's no question that they chose the anniversary on which to attack. But in the bigger picture, I think that Hamas wanted to put the Palestinian issue back out there. The Netanyahu government had assumed that by undermining the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank and by, they thought, sort of reaching a modus vivendi with Hamas, that the Palestinian issue could be ignored. And at the same time that they could double the number of settlements and give free rein to radical groups of Hilltop youth settlers on the West Bank. And I think Hamas wanted to be the one to shatter this belief, to put the issue back on the table, especially just at the moment when Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States were trying to put together a deal whereby the Saudis would recognize Israel, a deal that wouldn't have much in it for the Palestinians. So I think this attack was also meant to show the Arab world that the Palestinian issue was still there and that radical Islamists could break what Israel thought was an impenetrable border.
And so, so far Israel seems to be holding off on a ground invasion, but can Israel really destroy Hamas militarily? I mean, given past experience with military incursions into Gaza and the lessons learned out of Fallujah or Mosul in these urban warfare environments, how successful can a ground invasion really be?
This is surely the question of the hour. The Israelis, in fact, are hesitating because there's disagreement in the political leadership over just exactly that question. The problem is that Israel and the United States have had experience before in trying to go into urban warfare and crush militant movements. And the experience in Fallujah for the United States, in Mosul for US airplanes and Iraqi forces has always been rather grim. In Mosul, for example, and I was in Mosul during this period when East Mosul had fallen and the Iraqis were trying to take West Mosul and the US was providing bombing support. The thinking was that it would take 3 months at most to take back all of Mosul, and it took 9 months. And Iraqi commandos took a 50% casualty rate. And in the end, rather than going house to house, which was booby-trapped and taking heavy casualties, the Iraqi forces just had to call in the US planes and basically bomb West Mosul into the ground. So the fear is that if the Israeli forces go in full bore, it will take a tremendous loss in forces. They may not be able to root out all the underground tunnels. And in order to do it, they will have to bomb at a rate that will eclipse even the huge bombing rates that are going on now. And the casualties, civilian casualties, will be so enormous that there will be not only a huge international outcry, because all this is on TV and on video, but that it will force Iran to give the green light to Hezbollah, the militant group in southern Lebanon, to open a new front in the north of Israel. We're probably going to go into that in more questions, so I won't dwell on it. But the fears are, one, that it will force an expansion of the war that Israel doesn't want to deal with. Two, that Israel will get enmeshed in a quagmire and have to stay on in Gaza for months and maybe indefinitely. And three, this is very interesting and poignant. Israeli polls have shown a deep drop in support for going in immediately. On October 19th, 65% of Israelis supported a ground offensive. But as of a poll that was released today, only 49% say to wait, and 22% are undecided. Why is that? It's because of the hostages. Everyone is aware that if Israel goes in full force right now, many hostages may be killed. If the hostages are in the tunnels and the forces are going for the tunnels, then will the hostages remain alive? There are negotiations going on now with Qatar and Hamas, Qatar being the Gulf small country that has been providing financing for Hamas governance, supposedly not for the military, but money is fungible. Anyway, Qatar is negotiating on this, and there's rumors that 50 hostages will be released soon, but they'll be the ones with dual nationality. That probably includes about 24 Thai workers. Israelis are desperate to get the Israeli hostages out, and so that's a factor. And because of all these factors, apparently there's disagreement inside the Israeli security cabinet, which includes two opposition leaders who are both generals. And there's disagreement within the full cabinet. So the political echelons haven't decided, although the military is ready to go in right now. And that's where it stands.
Thank you. So let's stick with the civilian lives. Obviously, what happened on October 7th was monstrous. But the cost in Palestinian lives in Gaza is already enormous. And I guess some people are asking, is this an acceptable cost of war? And I'll put cost of war in quotes. How can innocent Palestinian lives be saved? And really, as you mentioned, what is at stake for Israel's reputation and support if it does go forward?
Right. I mean, this is an almost insoluble question. Obviously, after having had 1,200, 1,300 of their citizens killed, 1,000 of them civilians, and killed in horrendous ways, Israel has a right not only to defend itself, but to go after the killers who murdered their citizens. The problem is that Gaza, as most of our watchers know, is a very intensely settled small strip of sand along the Mediterranean that runs up against Egypt at its small end. It's only about 25 miles long and anywhere from roughly 3 to 7 miles wide. And so a huge proportion of the population is in the north, around Gaza City. The actual size of Gaza is only about the physical size of Philadelphia, about 140 square miles. But the population density, especially in the north, is extremely intense, far more than Philadelphia. So if you have Hamas operating out of civilian areas, which it does, I mean, it's not like there are big bases in the desert somewhere. And if you have them basing under civilian buildings, and if the tunnels, a network of about 300 miles of tunnels, like a spider's web, are under civilian buildings, you have an almost impossible situation. For example, Israel just announced this morning that Hamas's main headquarters is under Shifa Hospital, which is the main hospital in Gaza City. Now, to some people, that might seem impossible, but it's not. No matter how you feel about the clash between Israel and the Palestinians, I mean, I know from my experience in covering Iraq, Saddam Hussein put military bases under civilian, even civilian bomb shelters. There was a tragic example of a bomb shelter. We bombed the site because there was a major base underneath the bomb shelter, and we killed many people in the shelter. And so it wouldn't surprise me if the main headquarters was under Shifa Hospital. Israel has asked Gazans to go south, and it has asked Shifa Hospital to move all its patients and doctors south. The tragedy is, you can imagine moving a hospital with huge numbers of wounded people and lots of civilians sheltering there because you think it will be safe. We know, the courtyard was already bombed in a Gaza hospital, seemingly by a misfired rocket from Palestinian Jihad, and many people were killed. If you had to move the hospital on unsafe roads, well, it's impossible. Preemies, no electricity, seriously wounded. So it's a catch-22. What I have written is there really does need to be safe zones in the South and a safe corridor for people to evacuate. What's happened is that people who evacuated have been bombed on the roads going down south. They've been bombed in places that were supposedly safe where they're staying down south. And also, as a result of the Israeli siege, there's no water or electricity. So people are down there without water, without food for their babies. And some people are even coming back north to Gaza City. So the only plausible, it isn't a solution, but partial solution that I can see is safe zones where humanitarian aid could come in freely in the South. That might cause Israel some military problems. Maybe Hamas people would be down there too. But if you're going to protect and encourage Gazan civilians from the north to go south, they have to be safe. As for the hospital, I don't know what the answer is, because I would have few doubts that the headquarters of Hamas would be under it. After all, what would seem to be the safest place?
Now, so this following question from a reader is a little more involved, so I'm going to try and read it verbatim. They say, my gut feeling is that Americans, especially liberals who do not support Israel, fail to understand that Israel is smaller than New Jersey and in an incredibly vulnerable position, surrounded by currently and formerly hostile neighbors, some of them bent on Israel's destruction. So, Trudy, can you please discuss how Israel's incredibly vulnerable position in the Middle East affects its security policies and pushes the Israelis in policy directions that may not be in the liking of American liberals, but which many Israelis feel are vital to the existence of Israel?
I think we have to start from a position. Let's roll the clock back to October 6th, before this tragedy. I was, or even before October 6th, I was in Israel for 3 weeks in July. Israel had never felt so safe. Israel has one of the finest armies, certainly the best army in the region. It has a peace treaty with Jordan. It has a peace treaty with Egypt. and it was on the verge of a peace treaty with Saudi Arabia. It also has peace treaties with Gulf nations who never were at war with Israel. Its major enemy is Iran, and there's little belief that Iran would attack directly, but it has an ally, Hezbollah, in southern Lebanon, which is heavily armed with missiles that Iran has smuggled in through Syria. So the threat was an attack by Hezbollah, but most Israeli security experts believed that that threat would not be exercised unless Israel attacked Iran, that Hezbollah was Iran's hedge against an Israeli attack, for example, on their nuclear facilities. So one big threat, but unlikely to attack itself, more likely to use its proxy. Where was this analysis wrong? All right, there are Palestinians on the West Bank, there are Palestinians in Gaza. Israel thought that it had the Palestinian situation under control, or at least the Netanyahu government did. There were no peace talks, have been none for 14 years, or almost. And the assumption was, under this particular government, that you could give free rein to settlers, Jewish settlers in the West Bank, and basically de facto annex it, and that Gaza would give you no problem. I have written repeatedly, not because I'm supporting Hamas, but just because it was fact that the Palestinian problem was a political problem. And eventually, you couldn't keep 5 million people under control without some kind of political settlement. This Israeli government had a different position. So, yes, people have to understand Israel's vulnerability, but it's not a vulnerability as it might have been before the peace agreements with Egypt and Jordan. It's a vulnerability because it has these Palestinian territories, especially on the West Bank, which Israel wants to annex because they have Jewish holy places, and in Gaza, because nobody wants Gaza. Israel would give it back to Egypt, but Egypt doesn't want it. So you have all of these Palestinians, and there has to be a political settlement. Now, nobody would say it was easy. Peace talks were tried, and they failed. But life is unfair, and geography is unfair. So those Israelis who argued for a two-state solution and continue to do so, and I have done so in my column, although I don't know that that is possible, but what I know and what these Israelis have argued from a security perspective is you can't annex the West Bank and ignore Gaza and expect that things will always be okay, even if there was a deal with Saudi Arabia. And so we're now in a situation where there has to be some solution for the West Bank and Gaza. And in the end, it will have to be political, because even if Israel goes in with full force to Gaza, unless it wants to stay there, as it got stuck in Lebanon for 18 years, you will have some resistance movement turning up again. And let me quickly qualify here that when I describe Gaza, I also call it a terrorist movement and one Hamas. I mean, I don't believe that Israel can ever negotiate with Hamas, because Hamas, in its charter, calls for the full destruction of Israel and an Islamic state from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean. And we see the kind of military tactics it uses. But unless Israel can find or encourage political forces in the West Bank and Gaza to come back to the table and find some political settlement, this situation will go on and on.
You mentioned that Hamas is a terrorist organization. So how can those who sympathize with the Palestinian cause not fall victim to Hamas's propaganda or equate their goals with Palestine's goals?
Excuse me, I have a cough and I don't want to be coughing in the face of my listeners, so I'm drinking tea with honey. And back to this very serious question. I think in trying to parse this very complicated situation, I think it's totally understandable that Palestinians and supporters of Palestinians, family of Palestinians here, say, what is the end game? Will Israel occupy these territories forever? And if so, it has to give them full citizenship and rights. Now, many people thought that Gaza was no longer occupied because the Israelis pulled out in 2005. And I'll get back to the supporting Hamas question. But even though Israel pulled out, it controlled the borders, the land borders, the sea borders, and the air, except for the one opening to Egypt. So that Gaza was basically, as some have called it, an open air prison because you couldn't get in or out. Israel controlled the flow of supplies in and out, except for that Egyptian border or what was smuggled in. And Israel could turn off the electricity. It controls a large part of it. It could cut off supplies, as you see it's doing now. It could control fuel, which runs the electricity system. So basically, Israel still controlled Gaza. My reply to the questioner is, I do not think you can legitimately call Hamas, you can call it resistance, but I don't think you can support that kind of resistance unless you support the eradication of Israel and war crimes against Israeli civilians, which, as many journalists who've seen the videos, and I've only seen some of them, are totally, totally horrendous, along the lines of ISIS beheading, but in this case, just shooting up children in front of their parents, hacking people to death, etc. I don't need to repeat it. However, I think you need to deal with the representatives of the real, Palestinian people. Now, that used to be the Palestinian Authority, but Netanyahu has refused to deal with the Palestinian Authority for more than a decade. And that has helped undercut and weaken it because it has no ability to negotiate unless the Netanyahu government, because there have been several, is willing to deal with it. And so effectively, the sort of legitimate government, there haven't been elections for many years, but the last elected government is ignored by Israel while they allowed money to go into Hamas and cut off tax receipts, which they collect from Palestinian workers and is supposed to be sent to the West Bank, from going to the sort of legitimate government. So there has to be a rethinking. And if you're going to talk about resistance, I think, from my perspective, it has to be resistance that recognizes the state of Israel, but is agitating, hopefully peacefully, and if militarily, well, that's a whole other question, but not like Hamas, resistance that is pushing for negotiating two states and not for destroying the entire state of Israel.
And the question here about why has there been no clamor for Hamas? They are the technical government in Gaza to fuel hospitals and the desalination plants from its own stash of fuel, right? There is this call for allowing international aid to come in, allowing fuel to come in, but Hamas obviously has fuel. Why is there no pressure on Hamas to give the Gazan civilians that access to that fuel?
Of course, the Israeli government has been talking about this, and this this claim that Hamas has fuel, which is probably true, has been on the airwaves. The problem is the facts on the ground are what they are. Just like the strong possibility that Hamas's headquarters is under Shifa Hospital. I mean, Hamas is fighting with the tools they have at hand. And I think where that leaves Israel is they have to let in fuel. I know that Israel claims Hamas will take the fuel, but I can't believe that it's beyond the imagination or the negotiating possibility to assure that some fuel gets to hospitals for ventilators and so forth, and generators. Hamas has a weapon and they're using it, however much one might protest it. That is what it is. And Israel's choices are not good. And I think that it is unacceptable for a choice to be that all hospitals go dark.
Yeah. So could a war in Gaza lead to all-out war in the Middle East? I know you said that Israel has some peace treaties with some of its neighbors, but a protracted war, will it lead to war with Iran? Or a reader asked if it could even lead to nuclear war.
I don't think there's any chance of nuclear war. Iran doesn't yet have a nuclear weapon. And even if they had one, they wouldn't use it on behalf of the Palestinians because they would be wiped out. I think at the moment, there is still the possibility of preventing this war from spreading to an all-out regional war. As you've seen, Iran is using its proxies to hit at Americans. There's still 2,500 Americans in Iraq. Who knew? Some of us knew, but it's still sort of surprising. And there are some small U.S. bases on the edge of Syria and near the Syrian Kurdish areas in order to try to keep tabs on ISIS renewal. And so proxies of Iran have been trying to hit at those sites. And you've seen that the Houthis, an Iranian proxy in Yemen, fired missiles towards Israel, which one of our ships offshore took down. So I think at the moment, Iran probably doesn't want a full-scale war, doesn't want Hezbollah to be activated. Hezbollah is firing just into Israel's northern region, and Israel has evacuated 20 or 30,000 civilians from villages and one city in the north. But there's been no attempt to fire missiles, serious cruise missiles, into Tel Aviv or Haifa, because that would trigger an all-out war against Hezbollah. So I think much depends on how things go from here. And that's why Israel has this very difficult choice to make about how, when, and with how much force to go into Gaza, because one of the considerations is how do you prevent, in a sense, embarrassing Iran and Hezbollah into letting loose with more force. My bet is still that it won't turn into a wider war, but everything is up for grabs now because we're in the middle.
Could you talk a little bit more of what are the implications if Hezbollah does jump into the conflict?
Well, as I said, it's about how they jump in. I mean, obviously, Israel isn't going to keep its citizens in hotels far from the northern border forever. So I don't know that Hezbollah is going to go beyond that. It's already there. Obviously, if Hezbollah launched missiles at Haifa, at Tel Aviv, Israel would send in both forces, which they have on the ground, and airplanes. And basically, they would have to flatten southern Lebanon because, again, Hezbollah is known, because Israel's been in there before, to have its bases under civilian sites. So, I think Israel would greatly prefer not to do it, but there would be no choice if Hezbollah bombed big cities, and those missiles were not able to be deterred by Iron Dome.
Let me jump in with a question from an online reader. A clarification: are you saying if there is a Hamas base under that hospital, are you saying that it is okay to bomb that hospital for a possibility that there is a Hamas base under it?
No, I didn't say that at all. But what I'm saying is that Hezbollah is making use in a grotesque way of sick and ill and wounded people. And eventually, if Israel goes in there with ground troops in some way or another, they will have to figure out how to evacuate Shifa and take out that base. I don't think Israel's going to bomb the hospital, but that's why the base is there. And if it's really the total headquarters, if Israel goes in, they have to go after that. And I don't know how you square that circle. I don't think, and I'm not saying Israel should, that Israel will bomb the hospital. And I want to emphasize that all of the evidence and many journalistic outfits, serious ones, have done their own investigations, indicates that the missile that fell, and it was a rocket that fell in the courtyard of another hospital whose courtyard was bombed, was from a misfired Islamic Jihad rocket.
Thank you. So if Israel launches this ground attack, do they have an exit strategy?
That's one of the things that is holding up the invasion, because the options, none of them are great. Excuse me while my tea with honey calms my throat. The option that Israel doesn't want to do is to reoccupy Gaza. It would put Israel in an awful position of, having to have all kinds of troops in there, constant fighting, and responsible for the supply of Gazans, for keeping the entire population fed. I mean, this is the last thing Israel wants. But the question is, how do you go in, even assuming you can destroy all of Hamas, which is a big assumption, and then pull out and not have the same thing happen? Now, the only plans that have leaked out, well, actually, some cabinet ministers in Israel have spoken about them, that Israel seems to have at the moment, is to provide what they call a buffer zone inside Gaza after they leave, which would mean that a stretch of territory all along the border would become a fire zone, and anyone who entered into it would be killed. So instead of having protection on the Israeli side, you'd have it all inside Gaza. And then the idea being put forward is Israel would seal off all entrances and exits on their side of the border, would stop permitting any workers from Gaza to come in, and their salaries are very important for the Strip. But the feeling is that many of them spied and provided the knowledge of these kibbutzim, the layouts and so forth, and of the towns that were hit by rockets. And then Gaza would be left to its own deserts. Well, that's really a non-starter because, of course, Hamas or the next group would resume operations. I think we've seen that Hamas can't become an open-air prison. I think another Israeli hope was that Egypt would open the border and that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians would flee, and then they would not be allowed back again, and you'd have a huge new refugee camp in the desert. Well, Egypt doesn't want to support hundreds of thousands of angry Palestinian refugees. And so they've made clear that's not on. So then what's left? A lot of people are trying to come up with options from think tanks inside Israel, outside Israel. Some of the ideas, there's a suggestion that the UN would come in, and I think you can scrap that because UN peacekeeping troops don't come into an active shooter situation, which it surely would become. And we can see in southern Lebanon, when Hezbollah came in, the UN forces were totally neutered. They basically take their orders from Hezbollah, which I have personally seen back in the day, many years ago. But now, I mean, it's clear they can't go against Hezbollah. They don't have the firepower. So UN not. There's some talking about having some kind of an alliance of Arab countries that would send in some kind of, if not a force, then a temporary governing council. There are stories coming out that the United States, and I don't know that this is true, is thinking of a technician's temporary government until there's new elections, but I don't know who in Gaza would be willing to serve on it. I think new elections will ultimately be desirable, but then of course Hamas might get reelected just because people are so angry, even if whether they like or don't like it. And then lastly, but not leastly, many people would like to see the Palestinian Authority come back there. I mean, they're the leadership on the West Bank. The problem is, one, Israel has very much undermined them, and they've undermined themselves with corruption. And two, if they came in now, they'd be coming on the backs of the Israeli army. I don't know what the temporary solution will be because I don't know what's going to happen with the invasion. But I do think ultimately you're going to have some kind of temporary government, whether it's the Palestinian Authority coming in with representatives of some Arab countries, and then you're going to have new elections, and with maybe Hamas ruled out because it calls for the destruction of Israel. But I don't see an alternative to bringing back the Palestinian Authority, but you definitely can't bring them back now because they would be seen as Israeli puppets.
Thank you. And Trudy, if you want to take a little time to drink some tea, I'll remind viewers, if you have questions that you would like to submit, please do so at the bottom of the screen. Just include them as a comment, and we will get to some of those as time permits. Thank you. So, Trudy, so you've praised the Biden administration, their push for allowing humanitarian aid to go through. It feels like they've talked Israel a little bit into delaying the ground invasion. That might be a factor. What do you see the U.S.'s role in all of this?
Well, I praised President Biden because I believe that by going to Israel and by supporting Israel's right to fight back, he basically, this is a funny way of putting it, but he made himself, in a sense, president of Israel, or he gave himself total credibility. It's been amazing to me how many Israelis I spoke with say they trust Biden far more than Netanyahu, and they wish he was running the country. No, that's not something that's necessarily good for Biden or good for the US. But why it's useful, I think, is because I think the Netanyahu government is divided within itself. It has divided the country deeply over its effort to neuter the Supreme Court. And half of the country, at least, despises Netanyahu. And so I think it's good to have the U.S. weighing in as a sane partner. And I don't think that U.S. concerns are the only reason that Israel hasn't gone in, because there are the real reasons that I laid out. But I think that the U.S. has been putting in strong concerns about not rushing in, out of the real rage that is running through Israel over what happened, and also the embarrassment of the Israeli military for this humiliation. The U.S. is pushing Netanyahu to come up with some plan for afterwards that is halfway sensible, although we don't know how things will play out because of what will happen inside Gaza. They're trying to restrain civilian casualties. It's not too successful. And they're pushing for humanitarian aid zones. That hasn't succeeded yet. And one thing that infuriates me, it seems to me that the U.S. should be pushing much, much harder for Palestinian Americans who are stranded in Gaza, and there's about 600 of them, to be let out. I mean, the U.S. evacuated American citizens from Israel. And, if dual citizens in Israel were eligible for that evacuation, it seems to me that the U.S. has to be putting its foot down regarding Israel, both Israel and Egypt, in terms of letting out dual citizens. There have been some stories coming out that Hamas is blocking people both from coming south and from leaving. I don't know if that's true, but I think the U.S. should be much more public about its demands that Palestinian American citizens be able to get out, because many of them are down in the south subject to bombing, and we should be protecting them. But beyond that, when it comes to Biden, so in a position to put pressure, not so successful yet, but I think helping to hold back the Israeli government from rash decisions. Where things get very, very interesting is that President Biden said publicly yesterday or the day before that when this war is over, Israel must come back to working for a two-state solution. And I think this is where American pressure has to be exerted. I would assume, and as a columnist who can express my opinions, I would hope that if and when the invasion of Gaza ends, the Netanyahu government would fall and there would be new elections. There is rage even among Likud supporters, Netanyahu's party, over the lapse, the security lapses and intelligence lapses, and Netanyahu has to take blame for that. But I also think there has to be a new government that recognizes what I said, that you can't simply assume that occupation can go on forever and that will be just fine, and there won't be any explosions. Now, obviously, after what happened on October 7th, Israelis are going to be extremely nervous about, any negotiations that could open any possibility for groups like Hamas, to spring up in any kind of second state beside Israel. So I don't know what the shape of that can be or will be, but I do know that this has shown something that cannot be avoided, which is you can't, and this is not anti-Israeli or anti-Jewish. It's just a fact. You can't rule over 5 million Palestinians who don't have equal rights forever. Some solution has to be found. You also cannot do what Netanyahu has been doing, which is permitting extremist, radical cabinet members who head up extremist, radical nationalist parties that he has in his cabinet because he needs their votes to stay in power. You cannot allow them to run the show in the West Bank, which is going on now, where they are calling for doubling the number of settlers from 500,000 to 1 million in the West Bank. They have given a total green light to radical settlers whom I have had contact with. And when I say radical, I mean radical, who have openly declared that their goal is to either force Palestinians to live as second-class citizens in a sort of apartheid-like West Bank, or for them to leave, or if they protest, to be crushed militarily. It just isn't workable. There has to be a political solution. This is not anti-Israel to say it. It's pro-Israel in a sense, because we have seen after October 7th that that formula, that hypothesis simply doesn't work. So this is not to root for Hezbollah. I think Israel has every right to try to crush them. This is, to state bluntly, that does not mean it can go back to ignoring the political Palestinian question.
Before we talk about the region's political future, we have a question from a viewer asking, under what conditions do you think Hamas would agree to release the hostages?
Well, obviously, the hostages are a great tool in the hands of the Israelis. And one of the disagreements that has been going on inside the Israeli cabinet, according to Israeli media, is that the military wants their invasion to be held irrespective of what happens to the hostages. They don't want to be limited, and this is what's being reported in Israel, because they feel like that would hold them back indefinitely because the hostages are in the tunnels and they want to destroy the tunnels. I mean, Hezbollah is obviously going to play this game out. The 50 hostages that are apparently being negotiated over are dual citizens and foreign nationals. From what I've seen, more than half of that 50, if you're going to let out all the strictly foreign nationals, are going to be South Asians, mainly Thais, who are guest workers. And then there will be some dual Israeli-French, Israeli-American, of which there are about 10 to 12. I think there's about 6 Israeli-French. And there's a few other dual Israeli citizens. I forget what they are. But that will leave, excuse me, more tea.
And take your time.
That will leave all of the Israeli civilians, plus many Israeli military hostages, several of whom are women who were doing computer work. And that's going to be very painful for Israelis to accept. So my guess is that Hamas will string this out as long as they possibly can, because that's good for them. And Israel will have to decide at the political level whether they are willing to sacrifice the hostages in order to finally invade.
Okay. Well, we're close to running out of time, but I have, in your column that's running on Sunday, you basically have a list of all the things that need to happen for a two-state solution to the process to even begin, right? And it seems like very insurmountable to a point. So how likely is a two-state solution? What is the future of the region?
I'll tell you, as a columnist, this is one of my great problems in writing about this situation, which I care about deeply. As some of my viewers may know, I've been covering both the Israeli and the Palestinian issue for my entire career as a journalist. I was based in Jerusalem for 6 years, but I also covered the Arab world. I was at Ben Gurion Airport when Sadat landed. I was standing in the middle of Israeli Foreign Service officers who were sobbing. I saw Sadat come out of his plane and put his arms around Golda Meir. I saw it from the back. I was several rows above that on risers. And, I've been writing about possibilities of two-state solution for years. I was also at the White House when Arafat and Rabin shook hands in front of President Clinton. I have no illusions, but I keep coming back to this question for the same reason that many Israeli security experts come back to it, because there's no good options. And an option of eternal occupation or what is effectively an apartheid state, where Palestinians are kept in small, disconnected enclaves on the West Bank, and Jewish settler numbers keep rising, and they live under Israeli law, which gives them all kinds of rights, which the Palestinians don't have, and don't have rights of movement, and can never really build an economy. It just can't last. And now we see that the assumptions about Gaza can't last. So what I think is that, first of all, there has to be a new government, and a government that brings Israel back together. Israel is painfully divided. In all my years of going to Israel, I've never seen anything like what I saw in April, where half the country, including the high-tech sector, which makes the Israeli government function, all of the elite military units who are the highest educated and have those tech skills. And mind you, they've gone back to fight now because of their loyalty to Israel, but they're disgusted with the Netanyahu government, where whole sections of the country and the population that could emigrate because they have all these skills and won't because they love Israel are totally alienated from this government, which is limiting women's rights because of its deals with ultra-Orthodox political parties, which is setting radical settlers loose on the West Bank. So there has to be a new government. There has to be a healing of the wounds. I think the ultra-Orthodox may be ready for that. I think they're scared also of what the country has been. There has to be an ostracization of these radical parties whose leaders used to be under security watch because they had either served terms in prison or been watched closely by the intelligence because they were considered dangerous. There has to be a resetting of the internal Israeli scene. And then there has to be a new look at the Palestinian Authority, whose leader is 87 and may not be with us too long. There has to be open dialogue with younger Palestinian leaders on the West Bank, civilian leaders who have ideas. There has to be an opening. There has to be an opening to Israeli Arabs who have been treated very badly by this Netanyahu government because they could be intermediaries. There just has to be a new thinking process out of which hopefully there might come some new ideas. And if Hamas is for now, crushed on the West Bank, which is a huge question mark. Gaza can't just be left to simmer. And I don't know the answer, because this has partly happened before, where Gaza has been rebuilt and the whole thing started all over again. But somehow Gazans and West Bankers have to be brought together to talk about this. Palestinians on the West Bank and in Gaza who understand that Israel will not and cannot be destroyed. I mean, we have to go back to the drawing boards. I was in Gaza in the 90s. I used to go there. I wrote about a friend of mine in my piece for Sunday that I cared for deeply. And she used to go to Nahal Oz, one of the kibbutzim that was destroyed, and bring her teachers with her. She ran kindergartens for the Quakers, the AFSC in Philadelphia, and brought her teachers so they could meet Jews whom they never met when they were locked inside Gaza. There has to be contacts with people in Gaza, and the policy of totally separating Gaza from the West Bank and allowing outside money to flow into Gaza to radical groups while undermining the Palestinian Authority, which recognizes Israel. That policy has to change. The whole focus has to be on finding a political solution yet again, because otherwise it's going to be the same old, same old. And if we don't have a wider war this time, we will in the future. So I also think there does have to be an effort to cement that Saudi-Israeli recognition, but that won't solve the problem. The problem has to be solved by, as painful as it will be, Israel reorienting itself, healing its own wounds, and then mounting the most intense search it can, perhaps with help from the Arab states, to try to find the political solution that has eluded them up till now, but has been ignored by the Netanyahu governments for all of this past decade, and just can't be ignored anymore.
Oh, thank you so much, Trudy. I think we'll leave it there. We are at time. It's always an incredible pleasure to speak with you, which I get to do, several times a week, and it's great for viewers to experience that. Thank you for everybody watching, for your time today. Thank you for joining us at Inquirer Live. You can direct your friends who missed the event to inquirer.com/live, where this will be posted shortly. And we hope to see you next time. And thank you so much.